Okay, we're alive. We are actually alive. It's been, I'd say it's been a while, but that's understating it, I think. This is still a brief history of everything. I am Chris.
I'm Thomas.
And we are recording for the first time in forever. Real world, life, work, for me, a brief hospital stint, all got in the way. And yeah, we haven't recorded for a long time. We're trying to make amends here. How have we been?
Very good, very good. I can't say I've had a hospital stint, so I couldn't complain about any of my busyness or work. So,
all the cool kids are doing it.
That's all the trend and the rage. Go to hospital.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's all the food. Also, since the last time we recorded, all of those jokes we made in that first series of podcasts about Donald Trump. Yeah.
What jokes? Don't know what you're talking about. They don't exist.
All hail glorious leader.
Alleged glorious leader.
It's still not officially glorious leader, but there's sort of confirmed glorious leader. That happened. We all know that happened. Everyone's going, but look forward to the podcast in the next few years' time when we actually look back on what the hell happened.
Yeah, I've got a feeling like in 70, 80 years from now, we will do the exact same topic, but applicable to the Trump election. So today, when we talk about the rise and fall of things and inevitability, we will go back and look at, was Trump inevitable, when we can see the bigger picture once the dust has settled.
Yeah, and it is the lure of hindsight. And what we're going to be talking about today is the idea, is anything in history inevitable? Is there anything in history that is always going to happen? And more importantly, is there anything in history that was always doomed to fail? And you hear it all the time, that was always going to fail. That was always going to fail. And I don't know about for Thomas, but for me, a lot of the time it seems a pretty cheap way out.
I would agree.
It's looking back on something and going, that was always going to happen. And if you were in a bar and you were talking to someone and you were talking about an event and they went, that was always going to happen, I could have told you that. That's the sort of person you want to punch in the face. Not that we encourage bar violence, but that's the sort of person you want to punch in the face. And I think for historians, it's something that needs to be dealt with, and it's something that I think we need to examine a little bit, and especially as we're encouraging people to read historians carefully, I think that this is a very important topic to really discuss.
Yeah, the more that you engage with history, the more tempting it becomes to see the narrative as this inevitable unfolding story, similar to the way that we do read. We read it in a book. There's a start, middle, and the end, and you know that an ending is coming and that there will be a middle and that at the start things will happen. Given that history is often experienced like that, as opposed to being, say, a lived experience, the way we experience history sort of tends to shape our understanding of how we perceive things as being inevitable, logical, and then tempted to say, well, how did they not see this happening at the time?
Yeah, and I think, again, it fits a lovely narrative, and I think a lot of the time, and we'll talk about this with the topics we're going to look at today, I think it causes people to be more comfortable. It causes people to be a lot more assured because they then feel a bit like, well, that was always going to happen. So, and the things we're going to tend to look at are going to be things where there were massive repercussions, and a lot of them were bad a lot of the time. And that's going to be something I think where people like looking and going, oh, good, it was always going to fail. So we know it's going to fail, so we don't really have to worry. Well, I think a lot of the time that's not the case.
I think that in all of the examples that we have a look at today, inevitability becomes a factor after, say, critical mass has been achieved or the tipping point has been achieved, but there are many sort of escape clauses leading up to that even as a historian looking back and saying, well, it looked inevitable, we can certainly find points where you go, actually, it still wasn't inevitable, and if this one thing had happened, everything would have changed, or this whole sequence of events is contingent on this one thing or these certain things. And it becomes so complex that you all of a sudden reach the point of saying, history seems to be more a series of coincidences than an inevitability.
Now let's go into the topics, because what we've done today is a bit different. We're actually being quite narrative, insofar as in the narrative we're telling is going to be 3 events that happened basically back to back to back, and caused sort of, if you believe in the idea of causation, it's causation. 1 into 1 into 1. There's a very big causation here. And what we're going to look at are 3 events that shaped the 20th century in particular. So we're sticking away from the ancient. It's all modern. It's all 20th century. And these are topics that are very well worn with a lot of people, but we also think they're very important to do. And, we do a lot of different topics. These are 3 that a lot of people like listening to, but I think they're also 3 that people are very, really engaged in. So we'll start with one that I know is very close to Thomas's heart. We're going to start with Weimar Germany. And we're going to have a look at the traditional, if you're in New South Wales, HSC style question of, was Weimar doomed to fail?
Yeah, it's a question that every student who does modern history and then does the Germany national study has to contend with. And it's probably the strongest example of a story being completely manufactured by hindsight and historians putting together the pieces on reflection and then shaping it around the ideas that things are doomed or inevitable or destined for certain things.
Now, just before we really launch into it, just to explain to people who may not really be au fait with Weimar Germany and what Weimar Germany is. The Weimar era is the era that begins immediately following World War I. It's the period of government set up where Germany moves away from the system that they've more traditionally taken in, Kaiser, those sorts of things, and they move towards what we would consider a democratic system of government. Now, in terms of the setup, we're going to actually go backwards. We're going to start from the end and work our way back to the origins. So you'll see when we go into the origins, though, it's quite a complicated thing to set up. Crazily enough, democracy in a country that hasn't done democracy, not easy. No one would know that. We haven't seen any modern examples of that at all. Iraq, sorry. just Iraq, yeah. Who knew that, you could look at examples from history. But they try to set up democracy in Germany that has never really had democracy to that level. And this is the system that comes out of it. Now, it goes all the way to what gets termed then the rise of Hitler. And this is where we're going to start from. We're going to start from, when does it end?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to pinpoint because Weimar's this constitution that governs the Weimar Republic, it's in essence instituted by 1933. That's the year that it's starting to fall out of favour. Hitler passes the first of quite a number of enabling acts, and it starts to just repeal piece after piece of this constitution. And consequently, many historians sort of say Weimar was dead in 1933 because the legal documents of Weimar, they came to an end. So you can't possibly say its existence is substantiated if the laws that establish it aren't there. Other historians will go back and say, well, it's prior to that. It's actually when Franz von Papen, who had been Chancellor in Germany and then kicked out, wanted the job back and then manipulated the political situation to allow Hitler to be installed as what he calls a Chancellor in chains, that von Papen would be the puppet master to Hitler, pulling the strings and making sure Weimar continued, but under Papen's ideas, not Hitler's ideas. So that happens in 1932. And some historians say, well, once von Papen has done this manipulation and put Hitler in power, Hitler had no intention of fulfilling the Weimar dream, and so it really is dead in 32. And then other historians go further back and say the Weimar Republic essentially died in 1929-30 with the Great Depression, and that not only was it ever able to re-establish itself with any real authority, but whatever came after the Great Depression was not Weimar and was not going to be a republic. It was going to be a battleground between the extreme left of the Communist Party and the extreme right of the fascists and the Nazis, and that whatever emerged out of there would not be a republic whatsoever. And so you have this contested point of failing, where is it 1929-30, is it 1932, is it 1933? But we can say with some general certainty that all three would stand up based on a different political skew, but certainly by 1930s it's dying.
Yeah, it's in a lot of trouble around the Great Depression, and it does, which is, as you know, people who study it, we sort of know this, which is very sad for Weimar, because in the period of the 20s, towards the mid to late 20s, Weimar starts thriving. And
yeah, there's a point in time, and you have to take the whole picture into understanding here. Most historians will put forward the idea that, yes, Weimar was thriving by the time 1928 comes around, and these early parts of 1929. And that's largely what's called the period of stability. And it looks like it's stable. It looks like it's overcome the real teething issues it faced in 1918, 19, and then once again in 23, 24. But by the time 1928 comes around, it looks as though it's a great degree of relative stability. Relative to its early years, it's quite stable. Other historians term those years as the deceptive stability, wherein all these layers of stability are masking the instability that is just waiting for a reason to come out. And without getting too much into it, there's an urban-rural divide. There are these extreme left and extreme right parties that haven't been adequately dealt with, and there's a weak foundation for the economy. So again, the story of Weimar becomes even more complex. The day that it fails is contested, and so too are the eras of stability. The only probably agreed upon part are the instabilities and the weaknesses in the earlier years.
And that's I think the thing about Weimar that makes it a really fascinating period to examine and look at is the fact that you can't get anyone to agree on anything about it. Really? Was it stable? Yes. No. Yes, it was. No, it was never stable. Was it doomed to fail? Yes. No. Maybe. Possibly. But what if? Did it cause Hitler? Yes. No. Yeah, who knows? It's so divisive amongst historians. And that's one of the reasons why, first of all, I think the doomed to fail narrative is a bit too simplistic. Because, you know, if there was an element there that was so intrinsically inbuilt, that meant that it was going to fail, then I don't think you'd have as much division as you do.
Yeah, I think the temptation, and we certainly see this a lot in classrooms, is that we often hear or see people say it was doomed because of either the Treaty of Versailles or the Constitution. And in those two things are 2 points of exploitation that Hitler and the Nazis used to great benefit for themselves. So in the Constitution, their system of deciding the Reichstag or the parliament is proportional representation, that if you get a certain percentage of the vote, you get that many seats. So it's very different to the systems of Australia or in America. It's very easy for a third party, fourth party, 100th party, extreme right, extreme left party to actually gain a presence in the parliamentary system.
It's a lot more like the modern Italian parliament, where someone can wake up in the morning and you have a new president in the afternoon.
Exactly right. And that's testament to those first few years of Weimar, where a lot of the chancellors only exist for a period of months before they have to renegotiate a new government and a new cabinet. And that's without even having had an election to actually change the makeup of the Reichstag. And it's the same reason why in the 1930s, as Weimar is undoubtedly starting to die, you have this quick succession of people coming in and out of the Chancellor's office and you can manipulate some rank outsider called Hitler, who no one estimates to be anything, to becoming the Chancellor.
Yeah, and as you're calling them, the Chancellor, as you've used the Chancellor in chains, the idea being that we can control this guy. He's really out on the fringe. Why don't we just put him in?
Yeah,
we'll just do what we want, but we'll put him up there as the figurehead, and that went well. So with Weimar, now let's sort of break down this idea of, was it doomed to fail? Now, one of my perspectives on it is that, and it seems like a fairly simplistic answer, but I think it's the case. I think the 1929 Great Depression, that really, I don't want to say it destroys any argument, yes or no, but I think that the Depression is such a unique circumstance, and it is a circumstance that hits at just the right time, pressure point wise. My view on Weimar has always been that with that period of stability that had taken place, stability/false stability, I've always maintained that if Weimar had managed to get another 2 or 3 years down the track before a big event like that hits, it's far more robust, it's far better at handling these challenges. And Weimar also is no longer quite as closely associated with the failures of the past, which I think also not doomed it to fail, but I think also dragged it down, was that it was very easy to go back to, look at what Weimar is. It's a clown show, it's a circus. Look at the number of chancellors that have rotated. And by the time they've had a couple of years of stability, the Depression hits, it's very easy to drag up this, they don't know what they're doing, they're a clown show, look at the number of chancellors, because it's in the recent memory. I've always maintained that if Weimar had probably got to 33 without having things like the Depression, then I think Weimar would have had a far more robust chance of survival. Do I think that system would necessarily still be in place today? No. Do I think they would have then been able to have made adjustments? Yes. And I think that's, for me, more of the key point, that it wasn't doomed to fail. It also wasn't set up to succeed.
That's probably the motto of Weimar. Not doomed to fail, but certainly not set up to succeed.
I haven't seen their coat of arms, but
yeah, it's just in that, some sort of
in the scroll.
And then like the logo off it is just like ruins.
Stresemann.
What it started as, and that's what.
No, it's Stresemann with his head in his hands.
Now you bring up Stresemann. I think that when you say the Great Depression came at the exact right time, I like a number of people, a number of historians think that had Stresemann managed to survive into the Great Depression, probably Weimar would have had a greater chance. He was the last unifying chancellor. He had been even though he'd only had a 3-month stint, he was in every government from him being chancellor. And primarily he served in the Foreign Office, which was giving him the capacity to successfully negotiate the reparations repayments that were from the Treaty of Versailles down and to a more manageable process. You've got the Dawes and then the Young Plan.
And he does a brilliant job on those there.
He's the person who's keeping the economy alive internationally. Domestically, there's arguments to say that he's not necessarily, he's having less impact there, but he's having sort of knock-on effects into the domestic. And let's not forget, he's the guy who manages to help Germany through the years of hyperinflation, where inflation is the natural increase of prices in a capitalist economy. Every year prices go up. In hyperinflation, things go up at a ridiculous rate of, sometimes 100% a day. Wherein by the end of 1923 or thereabouts, one US dollar will buy 1 trillion German dollars, and you couldn't even buy a loaf of bread with that. So a person's weekly wages are essentially worthless. Now, Stresemann is the person to help guide Germany through that. Because he dies before the Great Depression, there's no one to fall back on in the German government, say, we've got a hero and we've got someone that has done this before, let's trust the system here. Instead, he dies, then the stock market happens 20 days later or thereabouts, the Black Tuesday stock crash. 20 days later, and there's no stability in the government. There's no one the government or the people can turn to and look to and say, this guy's fixed the problem before, let's help him fix it again. And consequently, the economic weaknesses are exposed, which were founded in 1918, some would say. I've been reading a more recent book from, I think it's Richard Overy. He's published more of a economic history of Germany from the start of World War One, and his argument is that the economic troubles of Weimar start in 1914 with the abandoning of the gold standard, the running up of government debt to fund the war, and then the sale of war bonds and a deregulated war bond market, which essentially lead people to just buying up the potential to get their money back, but because they lose the war, they don't get any of it back.
No, and in fact, everybody gets Germany's money except for Germany.
Yeah, except the German.
And the cynic in me looks at the timing of Stresemann's death, and as you pointed out, it is so close to the Depression hitting. And the cynic in me looks at it and thinks that Stresemann just sort of had this premonition it was coming and went, I'm out.
Yeah. So I'm checking out here.
I don't want to deal with this. I had hyperinflation.
Yeah, I did hyperinflation. I can't do global.
I can't. I fixed Germany, sort of. I can't fix the planet. Like, I'm out. No, much like the 20s. It's the 2016 for Stresemann. But I think you're sort of right there too. With if Stresemann had managed to live into the Depression and had been a voice, he would have been the most powerful voice in that room. Mm. He would have been the voice that would have carried the gravitas around Germany, and he would have been the calming figure. And I think that it's not a coincidence that you see the National Socialist Party and Hitler having more and more sway post-1930, not just because of the Depression. I think the lack of a Stresemann is a very massive part of that too. The fact that there's no Stresemann anchor on the other side that has credibility to go, this man's a fraud, this man's not what you think he is, this man has no solutions. For example, I don't believe the von Papen deal remotely happens if Stresemann is still somewhere within the cabinet.
Yeah, I think we talk about sort of popularism today in today's politics. People like Donald Trump not running on policy but running on popular rhetoric. That was Hitler's doing in the 1930s. He said, they stabbed us in the back. Germany never lost. It's the politicians. It's the people you hate. They're the people that you need to take it out. And I've got solutions. No one says, what are the solutions? He just says, I've got solutions. Make Germany great again is essentially the early cry that he's got. There's no popularism or popular politician from the centre or even really the left that can step into the void that Hitler steps into. Stresemann's dead. Ebert, who was probably the only earlier person who could have done that, he's died in the earlier 20s. He was the founder of Weimar Germany, and he could have, again, had that gravity. He's not a great speaker. He's not a career politician. What he is just a stable guy. He's a guy that Germany looks at and trusts to guide them through those early years of instability. But with Stresemann and Ebert both gone, you're left to these sort of career politicians of von Papen and Brüning who just want politics because it's a good job and because there's power, not because they're necessarily in it for the great, true reasons that Weimar was founded on. The only other person who might have been able to stand up and present themselves as a celebrity to oppose Hitler is actually the president at the time, Hindenburg. Hindenburg's the only person from the old years that anyone respects anymore, and he's already been boxed in as president. He can't stop Hitler because it would largely be seen as unconstitutional.
And that's a really good link into where I wanted to head next, which is what about Hindenburg and Hindenburg's role in the whole Weimar Republic and towards the end of the Weimar Republic. Now, as you know, as we get towards the Depression, the other thing is that Hindenburg's well and truly getting on. He's very sickly for the last period of Weimar, leading obviously to the next bit of fantastic historical timing of Hitler becomes Chancellor, Hindenburg drops dead.
Yeah, the few months in between Hitler becoming Chancellor and Hindenburg's death, I mean, Hindenburg loathes Hitler. He's got derogatory nicknames for him. He just looks down at him as the little corporal, the little private, and just flicks him off. And he's the person who Hitler is the most worried about. Hitler doesn't go full Hitler until Hindenburg's dead. He has to respect Hindenburg because even he realizes that Hindenburg can stop the Nazi Party in 1 second. Whether it's political power or the popularist message, Hindenburg is the last threat to Hitler. And so consequently, there's if he's capable of respect, Hitler respected the authority of Hindenburg until he died. And then just go Third Reich, run wild.
And the other reason why he had to respect Hindenburg was while Hitler carried around his own troops. Hindenburg had the army.
Yeah.
And if Hindenburg says to the army, take them out, it's Paul and Hindenburg.
Yeah.
Taking out whoever Hindenburg says take out, it's yes, 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 yes.
I think Hindenburg has a greater army in the people as well. The people respect Hindenburg. In the election to get Hindenburg elected, he's overwhelmingly elected ahead of people like Hitler. He's elected on some massive double-digit victory ahead of Hitler's own candidacy. So it's clear that Hindenburg is more nationally popular than Hitler, and as a consequence, unless you really want to annoy all those voters and put them offside, you have to try and hold your hands up and say, okay, I'm going to let Hindenburg do his thing.
Yeah, and again, the best bit of timing for Hitler is Hindenburg's death. Now, overall, though, when it comes to Weimar and the idea of was it always doomed to fail, I'm of the opinion it wasn't. I'm of the opinion it would have morphed, it would have merged, it would have changed, but I don't believe it was always doomed to fail. I think that circumstances that take place from 29 onwards, starting with Streseman's death, actually, and then going from there, mean that it's not able to handle things the way it could have had it managed, as I said, to get through to that 33 period more effectively. And I think that global circumstances, and remember, America is brought to an absolute shuddering halt and right to its knees by the Great Depression. And if America had been on slightly weaker footing, it could have been cataclysmic for America. It could have been cataclysmic for most of the big powers in the world. It was already horrendous, but it could have been cataclysmic. It was just that we had this anomaly of this power that had been sort of shelled and then rebuilt in a new image that it was trying to learn. And for me, it was never doomed to fail, but it was a victim of circumstance.
Yeah. I think for me, and when I teach it, this ends up becoming the story I try to teach. It all comes back to the Treaty of Versailles. And that's where the temptation is, yes, it's doomed to fail because the Treaty of Versailles is there. As soon as the Treaty of Versailles is instituted, that means it's doomed to fail. So the day after it's signed, Weimar is on a path to failure. But I say, let's have a look at how it gets reworked, rewritten, adjusted, tweaked through the 20s. Who's to say that through the Great Depression and after it wasn't going to be tweaked again? So there's the Dawes and the Young Plan, which changed the reparations. The War Guilt Clause is a great sticking point for Germany, but who's to say that that couldn't be adjusted or amended or globally rejected later on if it looks like that would be beneficial? The treaty and the sort of took out territorial losses for Germany. Who's to say they couldn't acquire them back in a much more democratic process or could have thrived without a lot of them? It's the Treaty of Versailles for me that comes down to it. And so long as there's a Treaty of Versailles, there's a question mark over Weimar, but it's not always a guarantee that they will fail. It's the manipulation and the rewriting of it that could have allowed it to succeed and thrive post-Great Depression. But given the circumstances that arise after the Great Depression, the rise of fascism and Hitler just out and out rejecting it,
Thanks for bearing with us. Small technical glitch there. My MacBook threatened to blow up. You were saying about that it was about the end of Weimar Germany. You were talking about, the Treaty of Versailles being the main culprit in your mind.
Yeah, so sort of to draw a line under that one, the temptation is to say that it was inevitable because this feature was there. There was this looming threat the whole time. The economic, political instability comes from the Treaty of Versailles. But when you realise that there's an open door, in a sense, to some of those instabilities, it's possible that Weimar could have been saved had the right people been there at the right time who wanted to save it. The anti-Republican groups, largely being led by the Nazis at this time, they wanted to kill it. They wanted to kill it from the start. So consequently, whichever of those sort of two perspectives is going to come out dominant is the one that's going to ultimately decide the fate of Weimar.
And what I always find really amusing about that is that it's those anti-democratic groups working together to see the end of it, so that then they can fight it out as to which one of them gets to run Germany. It's kind of an interesting idea. We'll bond together with you to get rid of them so we can see which one of us gets to actually do it.
Yeah, the pro-Republic vote largely stayed solid throughout the 1920s and 30s, supporting all these factions who would ultimately go on to be used to the death of Weimar itself. And it's the rise of extremism, both on the left and the right, who both hate the idea of this republic existing, that for different reasons, of course, but they both hate it, and they're able to use what is proportional representation to divide and then devour Weimar amongst themselves, as opposed to a much more rigorous democratic system which would keep the balance of things much more steady, as opposed to what we see happen.
Yeah. And that's a really good stepping off point to move on to our next topic. Now, I know you're all really happy to hear that we're done with Germany and we're done with Weimar, and we're going to move on to something fresh and new. So let's move on to something fresh and new. Adolf Hitler. I warned you this was heavy 20th century. Adolf Hitler, there's a great narrative that springs up at the end of World War II, which basically tries to present this case that Adolf Hitler was always doomed to fail. Now, I think that fits into my narrative that I put forward before, which was that it's a way for people to feel more comfortable. It's a way for people to feel more secure. But this idea about Hitler feeling like there was this fait accompli, he was always going to fail in the end. Those sorts of leaders always do. I don't know about that one. I mean, I think that for me, the idea of Hitler being doomed to fail as a leader, you've got to really first of all work out, where do you count the failure? Do you count the failure as the moment he puts the bullet in his brain in the bunker in Berlin? There's a lot of B's in that sentence.
Alliteration.
Yeah, some fantastic alliteration. My English teacher would be so proud. Thank you, Mr. Pitt. Now,
Mr. Pitt.
Thank you, Mr. Pitt. But I don't know if you count that as the moment that Hitlerism failed, so to speak. Do you count it as invasion of Russia, the moment he goes to Russia? Do you count it as Stalingrad? Do you count it as the moment he moves away from the attack on Britain? Do you count it as the moment that he lets the British off the beach at Dunkirk? How do you define where Hitler and Nazis failed?
Yeah, the hard part is trying to figure out what they actually wanted to do. So generally speaking, you want to measure someone's success or failure against their goals. And if anyone listening has read Mein Kampf, it's a rambling diatribe of lots of incoherent ideas, all tied together with this sort of racial worldview. And if you try and get a measure of what was Hitler trying to do, what was he trying to achieve, and did he achieve that based on what we can get as close to being his own private words, his failure is from probably my perspective, when he dies, I don't think he ever gave up hope that maybe by the time he dies, he's largely given up hope. I mean, he's issuing orders to destroy Germany, burn everything to the ground, give the Russians nothing, make them suffer for their victory, all these sorts of things. So maybe some months before he commits suicide would be where I'd be saying he fails, primarily because if we look at his worldview, it's let's say racial and racist worldview. He's trying to create or remake Europe, maybe the world, along a whole new set of lines, and really shift the focus away from things like geopolitical concerns, which had obviously dominated the 19th and early 20th century, to much more ideological and racial concerns. So stopping communism, being the sort of the bulwark against that, and lifting up certain races at the expense of others. These are complete failures by the time 1946 rolls around. Yes, all these people have suffered. That's not to write them off and the lived experience of the Holocaust survivors or the Holocaust victims. But certainly, has he succeeded in eliminating the inferior races? No. In fact, they've gone on to thrive. Israel now exists. The Jews exist. Russia exists. Lebensraum does not exist. So when we look at, say, his foreign policy, he's failed largely there. And in terms of domestic, I think it's fair to say he wanted to be seen as this great emancipator for the German people, almost akin to, say, the heroics of Lincoln saving the divided America. Here came this Austrian to save the German people and lift them up out of their ruin and despair, which was Weimar. Did he do that? No, he in fact left them in ruin and despair and left them in a divided country for another 50 years before they now are a much more successful country. And they're successful by rejecting his principles of authoritarianism, fascism, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I think, a bit of the hallmark of the post-Hitler world within Germany, is that all the things that Hitler sort of preached that Germany needed to be in order to be great are the things that Germany rejected post-45, 46, to be great. By rejecting the Hitler views, Germany went on to thrive. Germany went on to be this great, grand economy in the world. And this sort of, at the moment, they're the country, they're copying some flack, obviously, on the right for, they're still copying some flack on the right now for their open borders policy. But Andrea Merkel sort of keeps on just pointing out, we need to be humanitarian about this. We need to
reject that which we were.
Yes. Why would you want to just start shutting down and going back to that sort of mentality? The only way the world improves is to open up a little bit more, not to close down a lot more. And I think that's a really interesting thing to see with Germany. And I think that's a large part of the failure of Hitler, is that his failings are more that his ideology dies out. His ideology, it doesn't die out, it gets bastardized and radicalized and used in other places. But as a Hitler mentality, that gets wiped. In fact, if anything, he sets back anything that he's remotely associated with is set back and destroyed. Again, one of my favorite areas to debate on that is eugenics. And, the science, quote unquote, of eugenics, which was used globally. It wasn't a German thing. It was used globally. The Americans loved eugenics. They were big fans. And it was the Nazi use of eugenics as part of the medical program that they had in place, where they were testing drugs and medications and medicines and just all sorts of tests on the disabled and infirmed. And then Jews, Gypsies, Roma, all those sorts of people, and those medical tests that took place. All of that meant that by 1946, 47, the rest of the world looks at eugenics and goes, no, we want nothing to do with this. This is not a science. This is a pseudoscience. And so, I think the failure of Hitler is the death of ideology. But I think a lot of people put the failure for Hitler in terms of a World War II context and a World War II spin. And if we put it for the moment in a World War II spin, do we have a solid moment where you can say that's the moment?
I think it's very hard. I mean, probably the closest we get by using our hindsight would be the invasion of Russia at the expense of invading Britain. I think probably most war historians would say wrong call there. Maybe invading neither was probably the better call, but certainly invading.
I don't know why you'd say that.
Invading Russia seems to have been the first step towards ruin, and so you can sort of trace it back if he had made. But then the inevitability of history, this is something I would say was inevitable. Hitler was always going to invade Russia. You just have to look at the things he was saying about the Slavic people or the Russians or the communists. He was always going to drive them into the sea.
And look at the terms of the Russo-Soviet, of the pact. The terms of the pact. It's basically when both sides sign that treaty, the deal is we won't attack each other, and in brackets, yet.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And they're both fully aware of this, and they're both happy to because neither are in a position to take each other on, especially the Russians. They're nowhere near mobilised. No,
I mean, when the Germans do attack, the Russians are still using World War I equipment.
Yeah, they're scrambling. They're still scrambling even by the end of it.
And they lose, I think it's a third, from memory, it's a third of the Russian Air Force on day one. Never takes off. It's just bombed.
Yep. And this is, so if you say, well, Russia was when he failed, you've got to go, well, if him invading Russia was inevitable, essentially Hitler himself then, like his ideology made him destined to fail.
Yeah,
like what he believes in led to his failure. So those days in prison in the 1920s or his times on the streets in Vienna in the teens, these are the times when he's forming his worldview, and that's when he was destined to fail.
Yeah, and again, this is where I think it comes back to our overarching point at the start, which is the idea of something being doomed to fail is a really difficult historical concept to argue because there are always get-off points. We were talking before the podcast about this topic in particular, and I raised a couple of things with regards to Hitler and military decisions that if either the decision goes the other way or an experienced general makes the call, Germany doesn't find itself in quite the predicament. Does it mean Germany wins? No. Does it mean Germany loses? No. What it means is the war now goes somewhere else. It goes a different.
Yeah, the war becomes different.
And again, you could argue the first big example of that is at the very start of the war with the retreating British Army. And the retreating British Army gets to Dunkirk and Hitler goes, oh, let him go.
Yeah, we'll take care of that later.
Yeah, and all the generals are standing there going, do it, do it, do it. We can get the British out of here in one. No. I know what I'm doing.
It changes everything, things like that.
Go. Keeps Britain in the war. You could argue that many of the decisions in the Russian campaign that Hitler made when he just started overruling generals and just started banishing generals. And by the end of the war, one of the reasons why those decisions all start falling apart is you no longer have competent generals running either army. It's now just two men. And it's Stalin on the one side, although Molotov and co do have a lot of a say there. But Stalin on one side and it's Hitler on the other. And they're just having this personal feud through warfare and just throwing men at the problem. And an experienced general, for example, doesn't let Stalingrad go that long. An experienced general doesn't let Stalingrad happen in the first place. So you could argue that when Hitler started overruling commanders, but he always had this power to overrule commanders. So I legitimately don't think you can say there is an inevitability about Hitler's downfall, especially not if you look at 39 and 40. You definitely can't say in 39 and 40 there's an inevitability about that.
No, in those 2 years, it looks like Germany will be Europe.
In fact, if Germany had, and you mentioned before about Britain, if Germany in fact probably consolidates what it has and builds up rather than going after Britain and going after Russia, then I think Germany's probably harder to shake from Europe And it's a lot more difficult for then any idea of a Normandy invasion to happen, for example. It's a different idea there, and maybe then Germany gets the ability to negotiate with other powers as a larger block of, we've now got this much of Europe, come talk to us. So I think that the idea of inevitability gets ruined by things like that, where you go, well, it's not inevitable. If certain things don't play a certain way, and again, it's the hindsight view, which is the difficult view. But I think that you can't say that you can't take the hindsight view in changing events and at the same time go, but I want to take the hindsight view and it was always going to happen that way. You know?
Yeah, it's very, very slippery slope to get into, where you say, oh, but if this thing had gone wrong, everything else would. And all of a sudden you're playing not just hindsight history, but fictional history, just writing your own stuff, like the sort of stuff we used to do.
Exactly.
And then on the other hand, if you say it's all inevitable, then you can't say, oh, but if this turned, because what you've just said is that couldn't turn, that everything that led up to it meant that the outcome was the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, that was a bit of a forerunner there. We are actually at some point in the near future going to do we used to do those fictional histories where you take a starting point and
what if?
Do a what if and then try to rewrite timelines. And we're going to bring one of those back for a podcast because they're so much fun to do. Are they historically accurate? Hell no.
No, not even in the slightest.
Yeah, I'm pretty certain I know which one I'd like to do too. So I think we'll roll with that. I think we might do the one that there's one in particular that we ran. Was it 30 years worth?
Yeah, we just keep going from it.
We got 30 years forward in history on one of our fictional histories, and I think we might run that because I think that was a good one. That was fun. So from Hitler, because I think we've both agreed that, was he always doomed to fail? No, he wasn't always doomed to fail. Someone with that much power, that much military, that much control, and that much of a head start on the rest of the world is not always doomed to fail. And the other thing you also have to take into account just before we move on is that, the impact of the United States in 1944, you can't sort of underestimate that, especially on troop numbers and just morale. If you're a German soldier and you get to 1944 and you're like, oh, here come the Russians, oh, the British will come back in a second, and suddenly you hear that the Americans are now coming, your response is, oh,
not again.
No, we come up with a plan to stop this. I thought that's why we had this. Didn't we have an alliance in the first place to stop this from happening? I remember this war. It's called World War One.
It's a repeat.
Now, Japan, I thought we paid you to do this.
It's not a bad investment.
Well, Tojo is what Tojo does. Now, to move on to our last of our three. I know we're going somewhat brief, and I say that knowing full well this is probably going to clear normal time anyway. Communism. Communism. See, we're hitting big topics. Was communism doomed to fail? Now, anything post 91, 92 rhetoric from the victorious capitalist side will loudly tell you that this system could never maintain itself. Will loudly tell you that communism failed because communism is a failed system. My first question to you, Thomas, have we ever seen a communist system?
No, I think if we take communism back to its roots of Marxism, have we ever seen a Marxist society based on the principles that Marx put forward? We've never seen that. You take the example of Russia. Stalin is a totalitarian. He is an authoritarian. He uses the message of communism to then just take power and institute a different version of the monarchy that had already existed, where all power is vested in these social elites who become the leaders of the party, and not necessarily the full revolution that was expected under sort of a communist revolution. It gets close at some points, but never really gets there. While Lenin was around, it was getting closer and closer, and maybe with the Trotsky, it might have got even closer. He was one who believed in the permanent revolution. But Stalin sort of throws the main concerns to the wind and just wants to establish a Soviet system, which is somewhat different. When you look at Mao,
once Trotsky and Lenin are out of the way, and Stalin is able to focus his energies on getting into the barn house, to do a lovely mixed metaphor there with Animal Farm, then, yeah, you don't have anything really resembling communism, as you put it, within the Marxist communism, which is, the original, the OG communism, as I believe the kids on the street all call it. The one thing you hear, corner to corner, all the OG communists represent. They're out on the streets. And modern interpretations, I think, really, when you go communism, you go Russia, you go China, you go Cuba, Vietnam to a degree, and you go North Korea. And I struggle to find a strong Marxist communist system in any of those.
Yeah, I don't think, you look at China, they're just as capitalist nearly as everyone else. It's just that the controlling or the ruling class used, once again, the guise of a single state authoritarian system to use or to maintain their influence, power and wealth. So, given that there's ideas of communism at play in all those places that you just said, but are any of them a Marxist system? No. But in a sense, this sort of goes back to the fundamental problem of Marxism. There needs to be a global system. It can't compete, or the role of communism is not to compete with the free market and have countries pick and choose bits and pieces. It's a global, holistic system as opposed to a country by country. So probably it's best to say that communism can't work unless everyone becomes, or Marxism can't work unless everyone is a Marxist, which probably is its greatest weakness, and maybe one reason why you could say it is doomed to fail, because all you need is one country to disagree or enough people to disagree, and all of a sudden you might have a bigger problem.
So to reframe it then, I think what we're actually asking, the question we're really asking, is not, was communism always doomed to fail, which is what it gets framed as all the time. I think the historical question we really want the answer to is, was socialism doomed to fail? I think that's probably closer.
Socialism, to me, is like warm milk. It's not hot enough to be hot chocolate, and it's not cold enough to put on your cereal. It's disgusting.
I'm getting you a shirt made.
Socialism it's this happy middle where you can probably win over a few of those free marketers who are like, but I really do have a soul and a morality. And then you get the communists who are sort of wavering, going, yeah, look, this is too big, but maybe if we could just have bits and pieces. And then out of this mold, you get socialism. And I think it's largely incompatible with both of the far left and the far right views, at least in terms of economics. But is it doomed to fail? It seems like it's doing a pretty decent job for the past 60 years, but I think the next 60 years will be the big tell. Once the basis of economies has completely changed, which socialism is built on. So there's socialist countries out there. I mean, say what you will, but America is as close to socialism they'll probably ever get right now. Australia, Great Britain, France, Germany, all these countries that have welfare systems and create what is derogatorily called a welfare nanny state and things like that. These countries have socialism to a degree, and more importantly, all these systems were built on industrial manufacturing economies while these places were still building things. Now they are service industries, and it's getting further away from that to becoming almost like a temporary economy where you're employed on an hourly rate or you're employed for temporary contracts. There's no sort of permanency. If we look at the rising unemployment and then we celebrate falling unemployment, it only comes out of part-time work. And so can socialism survive on the new economies that are emerging in the first worlds? I don't know if it can, especially when you take into account things like populations.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, where you get there are industries that were brought to their knees by socialism. In certain, the auto manufacturing industry was one in particular in Britain in the 1980s, 70s and 80s under Thatcher. where there was a legitimate need to push for improved wages. That was a very real claim, a very fair claim, and working hours. But then what you got was this very radicalised sort of social bent to what took place in the factories and within the Labor Party within Britain too. And what you ended up getting there was the reaction of the hard right to that was to link it into specifically into communism, to link it into that ideal of we're fighting the Cold War. Thatcher is on the grand stage fighting Russia. She's standing with Reagan. They're both there sort of telling the Russians how this world is going to be for the future. She's presenting herself as that Iron Lady. And you've got these auto workers in the northern parts of England who are out there protesting for things that are 17, 18% pay rises. And it's just not economically feasible under any system to offer those sorts of pay rises. So I think that it's a really interesting, and I do agree with you as much as I sort of made fun of it's like warm milk. It is very much like warm milk in that trying to even pin down socialism is tricky. As you pointed out before quite well, technically any country with a welfare system in place is a socialist state. Because pure capitalism would just say let them all survive or fail depending on what their economic means are. The market will find a natural level for everybody, and that's for everything. Now we'll look at this one. We can look at that when we look at the idea of will capitalism fail? As a lot of people would argue, it has. And don't worry, that's not me radicalising everyone to go out and be a bit global and kill your nearest rich person. The idea of capitalism and the idea of let the market control the market, I think, is shown to be hugely flawed. And the idea of socialism running everything for the sake of socialism is hugely flawed as well. And I think, is it doomed to fail? I don't think it's doomed to fail. I think I go a little bit back to what I go back to with Weimar on this one, which was that Weimar was doomed to be tweaked.
Yeah,
Doomed to be tweaked and changed and manipulated. It wasn't doomed to fail. And I think socialism, capitalism, and to be honest, almost any economic ism is just doomed to be tweaked. And
the ideas of Hegel there and dialectics comes in, where you're sort of always moving forward with an eye on the past to learn from those mistakes. You've got your thesis, which is the now, the antithesis, which is the problem, and out of
This is what happens when you criticise the system. He's being poisoned right now.
The system comes back at you. It's the free market. It's the invisible hand. It's choking me.
No, not the invisible hand.
You have your present and you have your problem, and out of the reconciliation of those two things, you have the future. And so essentially, if you say, and this is going back to Marxism 101, Marx never said capitalism is the worst thing ever and you should kill yourself for wanting it. He saw that as the natural progression of society, that you would go to the next step. So you went from one system to another to another. Capitalism is just an improvement on feudalism. Feudalism was an improvement on, serfs and servitude. All of these things are progressing in the right direction. So I imagine that Hegel or Marx would look at this current society and go, capitalism from the 1940s, 50s didn't really work, and so we went into socialism. That's the improvement. Now we've got problems. Our thesis is we've got socialism. Our antithesis, that is, there are problems with socialism. What is the reconciliation of this? And that's what we'll have in the future.
Yeah, and I think that it's the isms, as we said, evolve, and they have to evolve. It's very hard to find an ism that just sort of stays where it was and never adjusts and never adapts, because evolutionary process would dictate that that's what has to happen to anything. Is there needs to be an evolution, or you become stagnant and it just doesn't work anymore.
I mean, you can even look at the pillars of society, that being religion. I mean, even they change. Martin Luther comes along and creates the big split, and now all of a sudden in that time you have two versions of Christianity, or a third version. And then goes more and more and more, and it just keeps evolving as it just gets updated time and again.
Yep, it's like I always find it interesting that people who talk about religion and not changing with religions and forgetting, for example, especially within Australia when they talk about religion, and it's very strict and and a lot of these people, when you ask them, what church they are, they say Church of England.
Yeah. Do they know the history of that?
Henry VIII did that. Henry VIII did that because he wanted to keep marrying people.
Yeah, needed a divorce.
It's like it was a great religious moment. No, he wanted a divorce.
Yeah. He needed a new one.
Yeah, and if you're Henry VIII years ago, I can do that. So I think what we've sort of shown, I think, through the course of what we've talked about, is that the idea of inevitability and the idea of doom to fail in particular, you can't really argue it within history. Because there are always potential turning points. There are always potential changing points. There's always a chance. There's always a time where if one person makes a different decision, obviously everything then shifts again. And, does it mean, for example, as we said with Hitler, does it mean if he, does wipe out the British army that's standing on the beaches of Dunkirk, does that mean that Germany wins the war? No, not necessarily. What it does now is changes the circumstances under which the rest of the war is fought. If Germany don't go after them but instead consolidate, it just changes the context of the war and changes the circumstances and changes future events. So what we're really saying here is the idea of causality relating to from the start of an event to the end of an event. Causality is an element of hindsight. Causality is not something that you can look at beforehand and accurately 100% predict. You can see patterns and trends, definitely. And there are certain things that you can spot and go, okay, I see where the pattern is going. But events will never play out the same. If they did, all history would be the same. And if they did, Hillary Clinton would be president. So, and unfortunately, not the case.
No.
So, and with that, I think we finish our first one back. This has been pretty good. Having said that, it's going to be a couple of weeks before you get the next one because someone is travelling.
Yes, that someone is me.
Yes, although there may be, I haven't mentioned this to you, but there may be a brief episode in your absence.
Please.
I'll talk to you about that later. My people will call your people overseas. But if in the case there's not, we will be a couple of weeks this time. We're not even going to pretend that we're going to be faster, but we will be back to a more regular thing. This is too much fun to not do. So yes. I think with that, I think we've said all we need to say today. We've done all the damage we can do here. You have obviously, as far as I'm aware, been Thomas.
I am.
And I've been Chris, and I will catch you all on the flip side.